Hello again, it's me, Professor Fleming, with the second installment of a 7-part series on Timeline Earth, the Grand Narrative. Today we're going to be focusing in on the hunter-gatherer. As a review from the last lecture, we began to understand the long history of the planet and the relatively short time that we've been here. And we looked at the major events that helped shape the planet the way we understand it today. The beginning of photosynthesis, the beginning of land animals 500 million years ago, the Pangea, the Earth is once a solid landmass that broke apart. We looked at the time of the giant meteor that hits the Earth that begins the Cenozoic period. And we also talked about the time that we're in and the impacts that anthropogenic climate change could potentially have on the planet. And we decided that it was important to understand better our relationship to nature as part of our worldview, as both to understand the problem but also to begin to think about solutions. And maybe some solutions could be found as far back as the age of the hunter-gatherer. So let's zoom in into our timeline and begin to explore in more detail the history of humanity on the planet. And this is a 4 million year timeline of humankind, but really this most of the time was spent as pre-humans, or not humans as we would think of them, as hominids perhaps. This lecture is going to be starting at when humans began to look like us, standing upright and beginning to do the kinds of things that we expect that humans would do. And so we call this the age of the hunter-gatherer. There was a lot of foraging and certainly some rudimentary horticulture that was already occurring at this time. So, horticulture is very different than agriculture, but humans were smart enough to begin to think about controlling plants for food and for nourishment. Now, in the last lecture, I presented to you this wonderfully complex or simple diagram, depending on how you look at it. A couple things to think about in terms of worldview. We were in the middle of an ice age. That meant very, very cold in the northern hemisphere, with interglacials now and then to warm the planet. And certainly the cosmos might have been considered as magical, and that will change over time as we become more intellectually oriented. What I'm most concerned about is the relationship between the original humans, the hunter-gatherers, and what I'm calling animistic nature, which is nature that was considered then at least to be infused with spirit. And the idea, for example, that before language, humans were just part of the food chain. They were part of nature. There was no word for nature. In fact, there was no words at all. And so we look at this time probably romantically as if we were wandering through the forest, happy to be ignorant, when probably it was a pretty brutal and short existence. I'm not quite sure what the lifespan was, 20 years, 25 years. I doubt that most of us would go back to that time. But let's go in and look a little bit more closely into the timeline and key in on some of the major events that occurred that really helped bring us to where we are today. So, for example, 3.4 million years ago, the first use of tools was discovered or described by archaeologists. And tools themselves are probably not critical in the overall scheme of things, but the idea here is that humans begin to show the ability to think laterally, to look to elements in nature that could be then modeled and changed to do tasks for them to increase comfort. And that's a pattern that we'll see all throughout history. And in technology, and I would call controlled fire a technology, fire obviously gave us a sense of warmth and protection from animals, which is huge because security, as you know, would be one of the basis for moving into higher levels of thought. By being safer and having an extension of time into the day, married with human curiosity, which is in our DNA, we begin to see the idea of invention, of the idea of thinking abstractly to create things that we need to increase our chances for survival or increase our chances for comfort. Almost 650,000 years later, we finally get to what we think of as material culture. That is, humans creating things that we recognize as cultural artifacts, such as clothing or weaving or pottery. And really what I want to focus on today, though, is the idea of language. And according to the research, it wasn't until 40,000 BCE that humans actually built or evolved into the physical characteristics necessary to make sounds and to make those sounds maybe sound like words other than grunts. And this was really important not only for us in terms of survival, in terms of communication, but perhaps more importantly, it allowed us to develop a subject-object relationship with the natural world. The idea that a tree in the landscape could now have a name, that each animal could now have a name, that people could have names, allows the human mind to begin to subdivide and do analysis and create a mental map of the world that then can be used as a foundation for more complex and more sophisticated development of ideas and inventions. And so really at the end of this period, we also see the beginning of cave paintings, So not only are we using verbal words to abstractly represent elements in nature, we're also beginning to look at the idea of pictorial understanding of nature. Again, a further abstraction and or separation, not necessarily in a bad way, between us and the natural world. We're beginning to see ourselves as distinct from the natural world. And this is really critical because it builds what I call a subject-object relationship, where we can begin to be aware of the fact that we are separate and or different, not higher in this particular time, but certainly aware, being aware that we're distinct from the natural environment. The other thing at the end of this period is what is really the end of the Ice Age, the end of a climactic period that was obviously very cold. Glaciers are beginning to recede. And in the next installment, we're going to be moving into what is called the Holocene, which is an interglacial and a very beneficial time for human history. So I'll look forward to seeing you in the next lecture where we can talk some more about this.